The rain didn't just hit the glass of the trauma bay windows, it assaulted it. A relentless, hammering rhythm that threatened to drown out the beep of the cardiac monitors in Ward C. It was a vile night outside, the kind of weather that grounded choppers and made the roads into the Naval Medical Center slick with oil and mud. Inside, the air smelled of floor wax and copper. Just copper. That metallic tangle of blood that never quite scrubbed out of the grout, no matter how much bleach the cleaning crews poured. Maren Kerrigan stood near the supply cart, her hands folded in front of her scrubs. They were too big for her. The blue fabric bunched at her shoulders and dragged slightly at her heels, making her look smaller than she was. Frail, almost. She stared at the floor tiles, counting the scuff marks, waiting for the shout. It came right on schedule. Duck. Tellen Rost kicked the double doors open, his gloves already slick with something dark. He was shouting before he even cleared the threshold, his voice bouncing off the sterile walls. He needed saline. He needed pressure. He needed the new nurse to stop standing there like a statue and actually move. Maren flinched. It was a practiced movement, a slight hunch of the shoulders, eyes widening just enough to sell the panic. She scrambled for the saline bags, deliberately fumbling the first one so it slipped through her fingers and hit the linoleum with a wet slap. Rost swore, the sound harsh and exhausted. He didn't have time for rookies. He didn't have time for someone whose hands shook. Maren apologized, her voice thin, and grabbed a second bag, this time managing to hook it onto the stand next to the patient. The Marine on the gurney was young, maybe 22, his leg a mess of torn fatigues and hasty field dressings. He was thrashing, his eyes rolling back, fighting the anesthesia, fighting the pain, fighting ghosts Maren knew intimately. He lashed out, a blind backhand swinging wildly toward Rost's face. Maren didn't think. Her left hand shot out. It wasn't a grab. It was a check. Two of her fingers pressed into the bundle of nerves, just above the Marine's elbow. It was a specific, cruel point of leverage. The Marine's arm went dead instantly, dropping to the sheet like a stone. For a second, the room went quiet. The thrashing stopped. Rost blinked, looking from the patient's limp arm to Maren. The silence stretched thin, dangerous. Maren dropped her hand immediately, stepping back, her chest heaving as if she were terrified. She stammered that she was sorry, that she just tried to block him. Rost shook his head, the adrenaline overriding his curiosity. He went back to the wound, muttering that it was a lucky catch. Maren exhaled, but she didn't look at the doctor. She looked at the Marine. His eyes were open now, cleared of the panic, focusing on her with a sudden, sharp clarity. He looked at his numb arm, then at her face. He knew. You don't hit that nerve by accident. You don't stop a combat, trained man with a lucky tap. She held his gaze for a fraction of a second, a warning, before turning away to grab the gauze. The night wore on. The storm outside worsened, the thunder shaking the foundations of the 3-story building. The hospital was understaffed, a skeleton crew running the overnight shift while the main staff dealt with a pile up on the interstate. Ward C was isolated, a long corridor of recovery rooms at the south end of the complex. It was quiet, usually. Too quiet tonight. Maren moved through the rooms, checking vitals, adjusting pillows. She walked with a heavy, flat-footed gait, the walk of someone tired and unathletic. Every step was a lie. Under the baggy scrubs, her muscles were coiled tight. She wasn't watching the patients. She was watching the reflections in the dark windows. She was listening to the rhythm of the HVAC system, checking for variations. Around 0300, the main power flickered. The overhead fluorescence buzzed angrily, died, and then the red emergency track lighting kicked in. The hum of the backup generators vibrated through the floor. Dr. Rost came out of the break room, rubbing his temples. He told Maren to call maintenance to see if the grid was down county-wide. Maren picked up the receiver at the nurse's station. There was no dial tone, just a hollow, dead silence. She didn't tap the cradle. She didn't ask if anyone else had service. She gently placed the receiver back down and looked at the clock. The storm hadn't taken the lines. The lines had been cut. A micro twist of fear should have hit her then, but all she felt was the cold familiarity of the job. She looked down the long, red, lit hallway toward the elevator bank. The digital floor indicator above the steel doors was dead, but she heard the cables singing in the shaft. The car was moving. It was coming up. Rost was complaining about the AC cutting out, wiping sweat from his forehead. He didn't hear the elevator. He didn't know that the service elevators were locked out during a power transfer. Maren stepped out from behind the desk. She needed to get Rost into a room. She needed to clear the kill zone. She opened her mouth to speak, to invent a reason, a spill, a patient crashing, anything to move him. Then the elevator doors slid open. They didn't pry them. The doors opened smoothly, powered by an override key. 3 men stepped out. They wore wet ponchos, dark and heavy with rain. Under the ponchos, the shapes were wrong, too bulky, too rigid. They weren't maintenance. They weren't MPs. One of them looked up, scanning the hallway. He saw Rost. He saw Maren. He raised a gloved hand, not in a wave, but in a signal, a hold, gesture. Rost took a step forward, his authority instinct kicking in. He asked who they were, asked why they were on a restricted floor. The lead man didn't answer. He reached under his poncho. He didn't pull a radio. He pulled a suppressor-equipped carbine. The metal dull and matty black in the emergency light. Maren dropped her clipboard. It clattered loudly on the floor. It was the only warning she could give. The sound of the clipboard hitting the floor was swallowed instantly by the spit of the suppressed rifle. It wasn't a bang. It was a sharp, high-velocity crack, like a dry branch snapping under a heavy boot. The bullet didn't hit flesh. It punched through the drywall 3 inches from Dr. Rost's left ear, showering his shoulder in white gypsum dust. He stood there, paralyzed, his brain refusing to process the geometry of what had just happened. He was a man of medicine, a man who fixed broken things, not a man who watched them break in real time. Maren didn't freeze. She didn't have that luxury. She grabbed the back of Rost's scrub top, twisting the fabric into a tight knot, and yanked him backward with a force that was shocking for a woman of her apparent size. It wasn't a gentle pull. She threw her weight into it, effectively tripping him. They both went down in a heap, Maren landing hard on her hip, making sure her limbs splayed out in a convincing display of clumsy panic. She let out a sharp, terrified gasp, loud enough to echo in the hallway, loud enough to sell the lie. A second shot chewed up the linoleum where Rost had been standing a heartbeat before. Maren kicked the door to room 404 shut with her heel. It didn't lock. Hospital doors don't lock from the inside. Not in a trauma ward, but it broke the line of sight. The room was dark, lit only by the red bleed from the hallway and the erratic flash of lightning outside the window. The thunder rolled in a few seconds later, a deep, guttural vibration that rattled the instrument trays. Rost was scrambling backward on the floor, his heels skidding on the wax, pushing himself into the corner behind a supply cart. He was hyperventilating, short, shallow gasps that sounded like a saw cutting through wet wood. He tried to speak, to ask what was happening, but the words choked off in his throat. Maren stayed low, crawling toward him. She kept her head down, her movements frantic and uncoordinated to the untrained eye. But underneath the flailing, her eyes were scanning the room with cold precision. She checked the secondary exit, a shared bathroom connecting to the next room. The door was closed. She checked the window, 4th floor, sheer drop to the concrete loading dock. No exit there. She reached Rost and grabbed his wrist. His skin was clammy, his pulse hammering against her fingertips like a trapped bird. She squeezed hard, digging her nails in. It looked like she was clinging to him for comfort, but the pressure point she hit on his inner wrist forced his parasympathetic nervous system to stutter. His breathing hitched, then slowed. She put a finger to her lips, her eyes wide and glistening with tears. It was a perfect mask. Inside, her heart rate was resting at 50, 5 beats per minute. Footsteps in the hallway. They weren't running. That was the first thing Maren noticed. Panic runs. Fear runs. These men were walking. The sound of their boots was heavy, wet, and rhythmic. Slosh, step, pause, slosh, step, pause. They were moving in a stack, clearing the corridor sector by sector. This wasn't a random shooting. This wasn't a disgruntled former patient coming back with a grudge and a handgun. This was a sweep. Rost leaned in close, his voice a ragged whisper. He hissed that they were after the pharmacy cash. He said the storm delayed the armored pickup, and there were crates of OxyContin in the secure storage at the north end. It was a logical assumption. It was what anyone would think. Maren shook her head frantically, playing the part of the terrified skeptic, but she knew he was wrong. She had seen the lead man's eyes. He hadn't looked left toward the pharmacy doors. He had looked straight down the hall, toward the VIP recovery suites. They weren't here for drugs. They walked right past $1 million in narcotics without breaking stride. The footsteps stopped just outside the door. The silence that followed was heavier than the storm. Maren watched the shadow of 2 pairs of boots block the red light under the doorframe. She saw the shadow of a rifle barrel sweep across the gap. Rost stopped breathing entirely. He pressed his back so hard against the wall that his knuckles turned white. Maren shifted her weight. She had a unique physical tic. When she was assessing a threat range, she didn't squint. Instead, she dilated her focus, letting her eyelids droop slightly to cut out overhead glare, tilting her head 2 degrees to the right to align her dominant ear with the gap in the door. It made her look like she was fainting, like she was about to pass out from the stress. The door knob turned. It moved slowly, the latch clicking with agonizing slowness. The metal groaned. Merrin looked around the room for a weapon. There was a glass IV bottle, a heavy steel reflex hammer on the counter, a pair of trauma shears. Her hand twitched toward the shears, her fingers curling into a claw. She could take the first one through the door, drive the shears into the soft tissue under the jaw, pivot, use the body as a shield against the second shooter. It would take 3 seconds. But Rost was watching. If she moved like that, if she killed a man with that level of efficiency, the disguise was gone. And if the disguise was gone, she lost her tactical advantage for the rest of the night. She couldn't protect the other patients if she was identified as a combatant this early. The element of surprise was the only armor she had. She let her hand fall limp. She grabbed a bedpan from the lower shelf instead, holding it like a shield, trembling violently. It was pathetic. It was exactly what a nurse should do. The door opened 6 inches. A beam of white tactical light cut through the red darkness. It swept the room, blindingly bright. It hit the empty bed. It hit the monitor. It hit Merrin and Rost huddled in the corner. Merrin screamed. It was a high, shrill sound, piercing and jagged. She threw the bedpan. It clattered uselessly against the doorframe, missing the gunman by 2 feet. The light held on them. Merrin hid her face in her hands, sobbing, curling into a ball to make herself look small, harmless, and utterly broken. She waited for the bullet. She tensed her core, preparing to take the round in the shoulder or the thigh, calculating the damage, planning the counter-attack from the ground. But the shot didn't come. The gunman grunted. A deep, distorted voice came from behind the light. He said clear. He said they were just staff, no weapons. The light clicked off. The door was pulled shut. Merrin stayed curled in a ball, listening. She heard them move on to the next room. They didn't care about witnesses. Not yet. They were on a timeline. They were hunting something specific. And they didn't have time to execute 2 terrified civilians who were cowering in a corner. Rost slumped forward, weeping with relief. He whispered that they were lucky. He whispered that God was watching out for them. Merrin lifted her head slowly. She wiped the fake tears from her cheeks. Her expression was blank in the darkness. She watched the door, her mind racing. They hadn't killed them because they were professionals maintaining noise, discipline, and speed. That meant they were confident, overconfident. They thought they owned the building. They thought the only thing between them and their target was a few locked doors and a storm. Merrin looked at her hands. They were steady. She looked at Rost. He was broken, useless for a fight, but he had a key card, a master override for the elevators. She reached out and touched his shoulder, her voice trembling just enough to keep the act alive. She asked if he had his access badge. She told him they needed to move. Not to the exit, but deeper in. Rost looked at her like she was insane. He wanted to hide. He wanted to wait for the police. Merrin shook her head. She whispered that the police couldn't get up the flooded hill. She told him there was a patient in room 412 who needed critical meds, a lie she hoped would trigger his Hippocratic duty. But she didn't care about the meds. Room 412 had a view of the south parking lot. She needed to see their extraction vehicle. She needed to know how many more were waiting in the rain. She stood up, her knees knocking together, and offered a hand to the doctor. It was time to go back into the hallway. The hallway stretched out like a red artery, pulsing with the erratic flicker of the emergency strobes. Maren kept a grip on Dr. Rost's elbow, her fingers digging into the ulnar nerve just enough to steer him without him realizing he was being guided. To him, it felt like she was clinging to him for dear life, a terrified nurse seeking shelter behind the only authority figure left. To her, he was a variable, a loud, stumbling liability that she had to herd away from the kill zone. They moved past the nurse's station. The silence was heavy, pressurized, broken only by the squeak of Rost's rubber soles on the wet floor. Maren walked differently. She rolled her steps from the outside edge of the foot to the heel, a movement that absorbed sound and weight. It was a habit she had spent 3 years trying to unlearn in nursing school. But tonight, the muscle memory overrode the curriculum. Rost stopped abruptly at the junction of the east wing. He was breathing hard, his chest heaving under the stained scrub top. He pointed a shaking finger toward the wall-mounted fire alarm next to the linen closet. It was an old-fashioned pull station, a simple red lever behind a thin pane of glass. He whispered that he had to pull it. He said the noise would alert the base MPs, that it would bring the cavalry. Maren's heart rate didn't spike, but her mind raced through the schematics of the building. She knew the fire protocols of this facility better than the maintenance chief. If he pulled that lever, the magnetic locks on the fire doors would disengage, but the heavy steel containment shutters would drop over the stairwells and the main exits to seal off oxygen. It wouldn't bring help. It would turn Ward C into a sealed concrete box. It would trap the staff and the patients inside with a hit team that was already hunting them. She couldn't explain that. A nurse wouldn't know about the containment shutters. A nurse would want the alarm to ring. Rost reached for the glass, his hand trembling. He was desperate to do something, anything, to regain control of a world that had spiraled into violence. Maren didn't argue. She waited until his fingers were inches from the lever. Then she let her knees buckle. She threw her weight sideways, colliding with him hard, letting out a sharp, pathetic cry of exhaustion. She grabbed his waist as she fell, dragging him away from the wall. They hit the floor together, Maren landing awkwardly on her side, making sure to knock the wind out of him. Rost gasped, struggling to sit up, confused and irritated. He asked what was wrong with her. He hissed that she was going to get them killed with her clumsiness. Maren sat up, rubbing her ankle, feigning a sprain. She sobbed quietly, apologizing through hyperventilated breaths, telling him her legs just gave out. She grabbed his hand, begging him not to make a noise, begging him not to pull the alarm because the loud noise scared her. It was a childish, weak plea. It was perfect. Rost looked at her with a mix of pity and disgust. He pulled his hand away and abandoned the alarm idea, deciding that dragging a hysterical nurse was burden enough without adding a siren to the mix. He helped her up, his grip rough. They continued down the hall toward room 412. Inside the room, the air was stale. The patient, an elderly retired gunnery sergeant recovering from hip surgery, was sound asleep, sedated heavily by the night meds. He didn't move as they slipped in and closed the door. Maren limped toward the window, keeping her profile low. She pressed her forehead against the cold glass, using her hands to cup her eyes and block the reflection of the red emergency lights. Below, the parking lot was a sheet of black water, lashed by the gale. She scanned the perimeter. The main gates were closed. No flashing lights. No sirens cutting through the storm. The police weren't coming. The roads were washed out. Then she saw it. Parked directly under the overhang of the ambulance bay was a single vehicle. It wasn't a standard ambulance. It was a matte, grey transport van, boxy and nondescript. But the suspension was compressed tight against the wheel wells. That vehicle was heavy, armored, and there was something else. A small, rhythmic flash coming from the driver's side mirror. It wasn't a turn signal. It was an infrared strobe, pulsing a 3-beat pattern. Twist minor evidence. Maren froze. That pattern. 3 rapid flashes, 1 long pause. In the Teams, that was a LZ hot hold position signal. But these weren't Teams. The timing was slightly off, the interval just a fraction of a second too slow. It was a mimic. Whoever was down there was using outdated NATO signaling protocols. She felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. These weren't just mercenaries. They were former coalition operators, men who knew the playbook because they had helped write it. Rost was at the bedside, checking the old man's pulse. He whispered that they should barricade the door. He started pushing a heavy recliner across the floor. The chair legs screeched against the linoleum. Maren spun around, her eyes wide with fake terror, shushing him violently. She pointed to the ceiling vents. She whispered that sound travels through the ducts. It was a lie, but it stopped him. She needed a weapon. The bedpan was a joke. She scanned the room again. The old man's walker stood in the corner. Aluminum tubing. Hollow. If she snapped the crossbar, she'd have 2 jagged shivs. But she couldn't destroy a patient's mobility aid in front of the doctor. Rost moved to the bathroom door and opened it. He waved her over, his face pale. He had found something. Maren limped over, expecting to see a hiding spot. Instead, she saw the bathroom window. It was small, frosted privacy glass, but it was unlatched. The wind was pushing it open and closed, letting rain spray onto the tile. Rost pointed out the window. There was a ledge, a concrete maintenance lip that ran along the side of the building. He whispered that they could climb out. They could edge along the wall to the fire escape. Maren looked at the ledge. It was 6 inches wide. Wet concrete, 30 feet up. In this wind, it was a suicide run for a civilian. Rost would slip before he made it 10 feet. She shook her head, backing away, acting the coward. She told him she couldn't do it. She told him she was afraid of heights. Rost grabbed her shoulders. He was desperate now. He needed to lead. He told her it was their only chance. He stepped up onto the toilet seat, reaching for the window frame to demonstrate how easy it was. As he pulled himself up, his scrub pocket caught on the door latch. A small, black object fell out of his pocket and clattered onto the tile. Maren looked down. It wasn't a phone. It wasn't a pager. It was a magazine for a 9mm pistol. She stared at it. Rost froze, half out the window. He looked back at her, his eyes changing. The panic in his face evaporated for a split second, replaced by a cold, calculating assessment. He wasn't just a doctor. Or maybe he was, but he was a doctor who came to work with a loaded weapon. He scrambled down, snatching the magazine from the floor before Maren could react. He shoved it back into his pocket, his breathing rigid. He looked at her, waiting for the question. Waiting to see if the dumb, clumsy nurse had put the pieces together. Maren didn't ask. She just whimpered and covered her face, turning away as if she hadn't seen a thing. But under her hands, her jaw set tight. She pressed her tongue hard against the roof of her mouth, stabilizing her focus. The game board had just changed. She wasn't just protecting a civilian. She was trapped in a room with an armed variable who was hiding his own secrets. From the hallway, the heavy sound of boots returned, closer this time. And now, they weren't walking. They were running. The boots stopped outside the door. This wasn't the rhythmic patrol of a hunter anymore. It was the chaotic shuffle of men in a hurry. Maren watched Rost's hands. He had managed to shove the magazine into the pistol grip, but his palms were slick with sweat. He was gripping the weapon, so tight his knuckles were white ridges, but his finger was resting on the trigger guard, not the trigger. It was the grip of a man who had seen movies about guns, but had never felt the recoil of one in a life or death fight. He hadn't racked the slide. There was no round in the chamber. If he pulled that trigger, all he would get was a hollow click, and that click would be the last sound he ever heard. Maren had a choice. She could whisper the command, tell him to rack it, to make the weapon hot. But if she did, the veneer of the terrified nurse would crack. A nurse doesn't know the difference between a loaded weapon and a paperweight. A nurse screams. So she screamed. It was a jagged, high-pitched wail that tore through the tense silence of the room. She threw herself backward, away from the window, crashing into a rolling tray of sterile instruments. Metal clattered against the tile, a deafening cascade of noise that masked the sound of the door handle turning. Rost flinched. The distraction worked perfectly. He spun toward her, his eyes wild, his concentration broken. The door didn't open. It exploded inward. The kick was precise, hitting the lock plate with enough force to splinter the frame. Two men surged into the room. They weren't moving with the slow, methodical sweep of the first pair. These men were rushing. Rost swung the gun back toward the door. He squeezed the trigger. Click. The sound was small, pathetic in the small room. The lead intruder didn't even slow down. He stepped inside the guard of Rost's extended arm and drove the butt of his rifle into the doctor's solar plexus. It was a brutal, efficient strike. Rost folded in half, the air rushing out of his lungs in a wheezing gasp. He dropped the useless pistol and collapsed, retching on the floor. Maren was already on her knees, her hands up, her face a mask of absolute submission. She was shaking, hyperventilating, begging them not to shoot. She made herself small, unthreatening, just another piece of hospital furniture to be ignored. But the gunman didn't ignore her. He grabbed her scrub top, bunching the fabric in his fist, and hauled her to her feet. He was huge, smelling of wet wool and gun oil. He didn't put a muzzle to her head. He didn't tie her hands. He dragged her toward the light. Look at me, he barked. His voice was accented, thick and guttural. You are trauma staff? You are surgical? Merrin nodded frantically, letting the tears spill over. She stammered that she was just a nurse, just a temp. Good, he said. He shoved her toward the door. Move. He didn't kill Rost. He didn't finish the job. He left the doctor gasping on the floor and pushed Merrin into the hallway. This was the first anomaly. Kill teams don't leave witnesses behind unless the timeline is collapsing. In the corridor, the scene was chaotic. The red emergency lights painted everything in the color of dried blood. Down the hall, near the nurses' station, 3 other men were clustered around a gurney. They weren't looting the pharmacy. They weren't setting charges. They were working on a patient. Merrin's tactical mind raced. This was a medical extraction. They had hit the hospital to retrieve one of their own. Someone high value. Someone who had been wounded in the field and brought here under a pseudonym. It fit the profile. The aggression, the speed, the specific target location. They were rescuing a comrade. Twist, action reframe. The man pushing Merrin shoved her toward the gurney. He is crashing. The man yelled. Fix him. Now. Merrin stumbled to the side of the stretcher, her hands trembling. She looked down, expecting to see a rough-faced mercenary, maybe a cartel heavy or a foreign operative. She expected tattoos, scars, the hard face of a career soldier. She froze. The man on the gurney was wearing a hospital gown, but it was torn open. His chest was a ruin of old scars and fresh bandages. But it wasn't a soldier, it was a boy. He couldn't have been more than 14. His skin was gray, his lips blue. A central line was torn out of his neck, bleeding sluggishly. He was emaciated, his ribs showing through the thin skin. This wasn't a combatant. This was a prisoner, or a victim. He needs epinephrine, one of the men shouted, thrusting a syringe into Merrin's hand. Dose it. Do it now. Merrin stared at the syringe. Her assumption shattered. They weren't rescuing a soldier. They were stealing a child. A false signal had been sent to her brain, and she had swallowed it whole. She thought she was dealing with a standard paramilitary extraction. She thought she knew the rules of engagement. But you don't bring a 5-man hit team to rescue a sick child unless that child is worth more than the building he's in. She looked at the monitor. Flatline. She didn't have to fake the urgency now. She capped the syringe, expelled the air bubble, and jammed it into the port on the boy's IV line. Start compressions, she screamed, her voice cracking with genuine stress. The massive gunman hesitated, then holstered his weapon and placed his huge, gloved hands on the boy's tiny chest. He began to pump. The rhythm was wrong, too slow, too heavy. Faster! Merrin commanded, forgetting her cover, forgetting the fear. Push harder. You're losing him. For a moment, in the flickering red light, the lines blurred. The killer became the lifesaver. The Navy SEAL nurse became the commander of the scene. And then she saw it. As the boy's gown shifted under the force of the compressions, a small tattoo became visible on the inside of his forearm. It was crude, done with a needle and ink in a cell somewhere. It wasn't a gang sign. It wasn't a name. It was a barcode. Merrin's blood ran cold. She knew that mark. She had seen it in a briefing dossier 3 years ago, in a classified file about human trafficking rings used to move biological assets across borders. This wasn't a rescue. This was a repossession. The monitor beeped once. Then again. A ragged rhythm returned. The boy gasped, his back arching off the mattress. "He is back," the leader growled. He grabbed Maren's arm again, his grip bruising. "You stabilized him. You are coming with us to the roof. If he dies before the chopper lands, you die first." He keyed his radio. Package secure. Nurse asset acquired. Moving to extraction. Maren stumbled as they shoved the gurney forward. They were heading for the elevators. They were taking her to the roof. She looked back at room 412. Roast was gone. The hallway was empty. She was alone with 5 armed men and a child who was marked like cattle, and she had just saved his life so they could sell him. The service elevator smelled of wet wool, ozone, and the metallic tang of dried blood. It was a confined steel box, ascending through the spine of the hospital with a groan of strained cables. Maren was on her knees beside the gurney, her hands moving in a rhythm that contradicted the terror on her face. To the 5 men towering over her, she was a frantic nurse trying to keep a fragile asset from expiring. To the camera in the corner of the ceiling, she was a blur of blue scrubs, but inside her mind, the world had slowed to a series of mathematical probabilities. She was surrounded, 5 targets, distance to target once, the leader 18 inches. Distance to target 2, the heavy, 3 feet. The other 3 were wedged against the back wall, weapons held at the low ready. Maren shifted her weight, feigning a slip as the elevator shuddered. Her hand brushed against the pocket of her scrub top. Inside, she had palmed a glass ampoule of potassium chloride she'd swiped from the crash cart. One jagged strike to the jugular of the leader, and he would be dead before he hit the floor. The confusion would give her 2 seconds. In 2 seconds, she could disarm the heavy. It was a viable solution. It was the tactical solution. It would neutralize the command structure immediately. But then the boy on the gurney let out a sound that wasn't human. It was a gurgle, a wet, drowning rattle. His chest stopped rising. "He is stopping," the leader barked, racking the slide of his rifle. "Fix him." Maren looked at the boy. His trachea was collapsing. The trauma of the movement had dislodged the airway. If she didn't reset it now, right now, he would be brain dead in 90 seconds. She looked at the leader's exposed neck. The pulse was visible, thumping just above his collar. The kill was right there. It was perfect. But if she took the shot, the ensuing firefight in this steel coffin would shred the boy. Even if she won, the boy would suffocate in the chaos. This was the fracture, the choice that tore the professional from the human. Maren let out a sob of frustration, a sound that masked her decision. She opened her hand. The glass ampoule, her only weapon, slipped from her sweat-slicked fingers. It didn't shatter. It rolled harmlessly under the gurney, disappearing into the grate of the floor track. She had disarmed herself. She jammed both hands under the boy's jaw, her thumbs digging into the soft tissue behind his earlobes. She performed a violent, aggressive jaw thrust maneuver, forcing his mouth open and pulling the tongue forward. The boy gasped, a ragged, desperate intake of air. "Hold the bag!" Maren screamed at the heavy, shoving the ventilation mask into his chest. "Squeeze it!" "Every 5 seconds!" The massive gunman hesitated, looking to his leader for permission. The leader nodded once, a sharp, curt motion. The heavy holstered his sidearm and took the bag with clumsy, gloved hands. He squeezed. The boy's chest rose. Maren slumped back against the metal wall, her hands shaking. This time, the tremor wasn't fake. She had just traded a guaranteed kill for a probability of survival. She had chosen the moral victory over the tactical one, and in her line of work, that was usually how you ended up in a flag-draped box. The elevator chimed. Floor 8. The helipad access. But the doors didn't open. The car jerked to a halt, hovering between floors. The lights flickered and died, leaving them in pitch blackness before the red emergency LEDs kicked back in. The leader tapped his earpiece. Overlord, we are stalled. Sitrep. Maren froze. Twist authority signal. Overlord. That wasn't a mercenary call sign. That wasn't a cartel handle. Overlord was the reserved frequency designator for the Joint Chiefs Domestic Crisis Channel. It was a code that didn't exist on the civilian spectrum. The voice that crackled back in the leader's ear was faint, but in the silence of the stalled elevator, Maren heard it. It was calm, American, and terrifyingly official. Hold position. Team leader, we have a visual on a secondary bird inbound. Wait for the hard clear. Maren's blood ran cold. They weren't fighting terrorists. They weren't fighting rogue agents. These men were taking orders from inside the house. Someone with high-level clearance had authorized this extraction. Someone who could ground civilian police and clear airspace for a black ops team. If she fought them, she wasn't just fighting 5 men. She was fighting the chain of command she had sworn to obey. The realization hit her like a physical blow. She wasn't the hero stopping a crime. To the people on the other end of that radio, she was the insurgent. She was the obstacle. The leader looked down at her. In the red light, his eyes were devoid of malice. They were just doing a job. "You are good, nurse," he said, his voice flat. "Keep him alive 5 more minutes. Then you go home." It was a lie. Maren knew it. You don't leave a witness who has heard the call sign. Overlord. She looked at the boy. He was stabilizing, his rhythm smoothing out under the clumsy care of the gunman. She had saved him for now, but she had trapped herself in a box with men who had the authority of God and the clearance to bury their mistakes. The elevator groaned again. The motor engaged. The car started to rise. Maren slowly moved her hand to her ankle. She didn't have a gun. She didn't have a knife. But she was wearing standard issue nursing clogs. Hard rubber soles. She slipped her right foot out of the shoe. She flexed her toes, feeling the cold steel of the floor. She couldn't outshoot them. She couldn't outrank them. She would have to outthink them. And she had exactly 1 floor left to do it. The elevator doors ground open, revealing the roof access vestibule. The world instantly exploded into noise. The thwack, thwack, thwack of rotor blades hammered the air, a physical pressure that vibrated in the teeth. The storm had turned violent, rain lashing horizontally through the open bay doors of the vestibule. The leader didn't hesitate. He stepped out into the deluge, waving a green chem light over his head to signal the hovering extraction craft. The black shape of the helicopter hung in the sky like a vulture, its nose dipped aggressively, skids wet with rain. The 2 riflemen followed him, fanning out to secure the perimeter of the helipad. "Move!" The heavy shouted, shoving the gurney forward. "Go! Go!" Marin was right beside him. She had one hand on the gurney rail, her bare foot finding purchase on the wet concrete of the vestibule floor. The heavy was distracted, his eyes squinting against the rotor wash, his focus entirely on the aircraft. They pushed the gurney toward the threshold. The boy was dead weight, his small body bouncing with every uneven crack in the floor. Marin saw the door stop. It was a heavy rubber wedge jammed under the steel fire door that separated the vestibule from the open roof. The leader and the rifleman were already 10 yards out, screaming into their headsets, heads down against the wind. This was the fracture point. If the boy went through that door, he was gone. He would be loaded onto a black site bird, and Marin would be executed on the tarmac as a loose end. She didn't reach for a weapon. She didn't try to punch the 300-pound man next to her. She stumbled. It looked like a slip on the wet floor. Her knee hit the ground, and as she went down, her right hand shot out. She didn't grab the door. She grabbed the rubber wedge. She yanked it free. The heavy steel door, driven by a powerful hydraulic closer and the force of the gale, force wind outside, swung shut. Sea liang. The sound was metallic and final, cutting off the roar of the helicopter instantly. The silence that followed was shocking. They were sealed in the vestibule. The leader and the tactical team were on the roof. Marin, the heavy, and the dying boy were trapped inside the concrete box. The heavy froze. He stared at the closed door. He saw the rubber wedge in Marin's hand. He didn't understand at first. His brain was trying to process why the clumsy nurse would remove the stop. He reached for the handle, shoving Marin aside. He wrenched it down locked. It was a security door, one-way access. It locked automatically from the outside to prevent roof re-entry during a lockdown. The heavy slammed his fist against the steel. "Open it," he screamed, his voice booming in the small space. He turned to Marin, his eyes wide with a sudden, dawning realization. You stupid bitch! You locked us in!" Marin stood up. She dropped the rubber wedge. It bounced softly on the floor. She didn't cower. She didn't cry. She stood with her feet shoulder-width apart. Her weight balanced on the balls of her feet. Her posture changed. The slump of the exhausted nurse vanished. Her shoulders squared. Her chin came up. The heavy saw it. He saw the change in her silhouette. He saw the way her hands were no longer trembling. "You blocked the extraction," he whispered, his hand drifting toward the pistol on his thigh. Twist, action reframe. He didn't draw the gun to kill her. He drew it to shoot the lock. "Get back!" he roared, raising the weapon toward the door handle. Marin couldn't let him open that door. She stepped inside his guard. It wasn't a flailing rush. It was a geometric entry. Her left hand slapped the barrel of the gun, deflecting the muzzle 2 inches to the right. The weapon discharged, the round sparking harmlessly off the steel doorframe, deafening in the enclosed space. Simultaneously, her right palm drove upward. Not a punch, but a ridge, hand strike, hard and precise. It connected with the bundle of nerves under his jawline. The heavy gagged, his head snapping back. He was massive, a wall of muscle and body armor, but biology is biology. He stumbled back, dropping the gun, clutching his throat. Marin kicked the pistol across the floor. It slid under the gurney. The heavy wheezed, shaking his head to clear the shock. He looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time. "Who are you?" he rasped. Marin didn't answer. She didn't have to. The radio on the heavy's vest crackled. The leader's voice cut through the static, sounding tinny and distant from the other side of the door. "Team 2! Breach! We have a burn order!" The overlord compromised the site. "Breach and sanitize!" The heavy's eyes went wide. He looked at the door, then at Marin. "They aren't coming back for us," he said, the realization hitting him harder than her strike. "The burn order. They're going to level the vestibule." Marin looked at the ceiling vents. She looked at the heavy. "Help me move him," she said. Her voice was no longer the thin, reedy voice of the nurse. It was low, commanded, and devoid of fear, or we all die in this box. The heavy hesitated. The enemy had just become his only chance of survival. The heavy, his tactical vest read Voss, didn't argue. The primitive part of his brain, the part that wanted to live, recognized the shift in hierarchy. He wasn't in charge anymore. The nurse was. He grabbed the bottom of the gurney, his massive biceps straining as he helped Marin slew the heavy steel frame sideways. They weren't using it for the patient. They were using it as a battering ram. "On my count," Marin said. Her voice was ice. "Drive it into the elevator seam. 3, 2, 1. They slammed the gurney into the center of the stalled elevator doors. Metal screeched against metal, a horrible, grinding sound that vibrated the floor plates. The doors popped off their track at the bottom, creating a triangular gap about 2 feet wide. A blast of cold, stale air from the shaft hit them. It smelled of grease and darkness. "The cables," Marin ordered. "We need the guide cables." Behind them, the vestibule door began to glow. A dull, angry orange spot appeared in the center of the steel, rapidly turning white. The team outside wasn't using explosives. They were using a thermal lance. They were melting the lock. It was silent, terrifyingly precise, and it meant they had less than 40 seconds before the door swung open and the kill zone was established. Voss looked at the glowing door, then back at Marin. He was sweating profusely now, the adrenaline crash hitting him hard. He watched as Marin stripped the sheets from the gurney. She didn't tear them randomly. She twisted them, wetting the fabric with saline from a discarded IV bag to increase tensile strength, and knotted them with a speed that blurred the eye. She tied a complex, triple loop friction hitch around the boy's chest and under his arms. Voss stared at the knot. Twist, minor evidence. He knew that knot. It wasn't standard infantry doctrine. It wasn't something you learned in a first aid course or a rock climbing gym. It was a variation of a Prusik loop used specifically for high-speed casualty extraction in maritime environments. He had seen it used only once before, by a SEAL team training on an oil rig in the North Sea. He looked at Marin's hands. They were scarred, yes, but it was the collar pattern that stopped him. A thick ridge of hardened skin on the web of her thumb and the outside of her index finger. The shooter's ridge, the mark of someone who has fired hundreds of thousands of rounds. The realization hit him like a hammer. Voss whispered, stepping back. The extraction 3 years ago, the Kabul hospital. You were the one who carried the diplomat out." Marin didn't look up. She cinched the knot tight on the boy. "Grab the cable, Voss. Slide down 10 feet. I'm lowering the package to you." "You're Kerrigan," Voss said, his voice hollow. "They said you were dead. They said you burned in the crash." The orange spot on the door sizzled. Molten metal began to drip onto the floor mat, smoking. "I am dead," Marin said, her eyes finally meeting his. They were flat, empty and terrifying. "Now move." Voss hesitated. The narrative in his head shattered. He wasn't the hunter, he was the prey. He had trapped himself in a box with a ghost who had a kill count higher than his entire platoon. But he moved. He squeezed through the gap in the elevator doors and reached for the greasy, oil-slicked guide cable in the center of the shaft. He wrapped his gloves around it, boots finding purchase on a structural beam. "Lower him!" Voss shouted up from the darkness. Marin picked up the boy. He was light, fragile, a bird with hollow bones. She fed him through the gap, the sheet, rope taut in her hands. Voss caught him, securing the boy against his chest with one massive arm, holding the cable with the other. "I have him!" Voss yelled. "Come on!" "The door is going." Marin stepped up to the gap. She looked at the rope. She looked at the door. The lock melted through with a wet pop. The door didn't swing open immediately. The wind outside caught it, slamming it back against the frame for a split second. Marin looked down the shaft. "Go," she said. "What?" Voss looked up, his face pale in the shaft's gloom. "Too much weight," Marin said calmly. "The sheet won't hold us both. Go to the 3rd floor. Force the doors. Get him out!" "No," Voss screamed. "They'll kill you." "Go!" Marin slashed the sheet with a trauma shear she pulled from her pocket, severing her connection to them. Voss dropped. He slid down the dark throat of the building, the boy clinging to him. Marin turned back to the vestibule. She was alone, unarmed, trapped. The door swung open. The leader stepped through the smoke, his rifle raised. He didn't see Voss. He didn't see the boy. He saw a small woman in oversized scrubs standing in front of the open elevator shaft. He saw the broken gurney. He saw the cut sheet. He raised his weapon, his finger tightening. He had his orders. Burn the site. Leave no witnesses. "Wait!" Voss's voice echoed up from the shaft, distorted and desperate. "Don't shoot! It's Kerrigan!" "It's Lieutenant Kerrigan." The leader froze. His finger hovered on the trigger. Kerrigan. The name hit him with the force of a physical blow. The intel reports. The missing operator. The ghost story. He lowered the rifle a fraction of an inch, his eyes narrowing behind his ballistic glasses. He looked at the woman. He looked for the confirmation. Marin smiled. It wasn't a nice smile. It was the smile of a wolf that knows the trap has sprung. "Too late," she whispered. She didn't attack him. She didn't run. She simply stepped backward, one step, into the void. She fell into the open shaft just as the leader surged forward, his hand grasping at empty air. He looked down. He saw nothing but blackness. He heard the whistle of wind. Then, from the darkness below, he heard the distinct, metallic clack of a catch engaging. She hadn't fallen to her death. She had jumped to the maintenance ladder on the far wall of the shaft. The leader stood in the open doorway, the rain lashing his back. He keyed his radio, his voice trembling for the first time. "Overlord," he said. Abort. Repeat, abort. We have a tier, one identifier. The target is active. Did you secure the package? The voice in his ear demanded. The leader looked at the empty vestibule. He looked at the severed sheet. No, he said, the realization sinking in. The delayed truth that would cost him everything. The package is gone, and she has my heavy weapons specialist with her. He had brought a hit squad to a hospital, and he had just handed an army of 2 the keys to the building. The rain stopped an hour before dawn. It didn't taper off. It just quit, as if the sky had run out of ammunition. The silence that followed was heavier than the storm. It was the silence of a crime scene where the yellow tape hadn't been strung yet, where the air still held the static charge of violence. In the vestibule on the roof, the leader stood alone. The elevator shaft gaped like a black mouth in the floor. He hadn't sent his men down. He hadn't pursued. He knew the tactical geometry of a vertical shaft against a tier 1 operator. It was a funnel of death. Anyone who went down that cable was just meat waiting to be processed. He tapped his earpiece one last time. "Overlord," he said, his voice flat. "The asset has burned the site. We are RTB. The package is lost." He didn't wait for a response. He didn't wait for the threats that would inevitably come from the voice on the other end. He signaled his remaining 2 men. They moved to the edge of the roof, rappelling down the north face to a waiting unmarked van on the service road. They left the hospital not as conquerors, but as men fleeing a ghost. 3 floors down, the elevator doors on the 3rd level were pried open. Voss squeezed through the gap, his chest heaving. He held the boy against him like a shield. The kid was conscious now, his eyes wide, taking in the massive, bruised man who was carrying him. Voss didn't look like a killer anymore. He looked like a man waking up from a long, bad dream. He walked through the empty maternity ward, the soft pastel colors on the walls clashing with the tactical gear on his chest. He found a nurse's station that was still staffed by a terrified night shift clerk who had been hiding under the desk. Voss placed the boy gently on the counter. He didn't say a word. He didn't threaten the clerk. He just reached into his vest, pulled out the encrypted radio that connected him to the Overlord network, and set it next to the boy. It was an offering. Evidence. The thread that would unravel the whole operation if anyone cared enough to pull it. He looked at the boy one last time. "Stay quiet," Voss rumbled. "She bought you a life. Don't waste it." Then Voss turned and walked toward the fire stairs. He disappeared into the gray morning light, a monster who had decided for one night to stop eating. Down in the lobby, the real chaos was just beginning. The county sheriffs had finally pushed through the flooded roads. Blue lights flashed against the wet glass, a chaotic disco of authority that arrived too late to do anything but take notes. Dr. Rost sat on the back of an ambulance, a shock blanket draped over his shoulders. A deputy was asking him questions, a notepad ready. Rost wasn't listening. He was staring at the employee roster board near the entrance. He watched a maintenance worker taking down the nameplates of the night staff. They were removing the temporary tags. Rost stood up, the blanket falling into a puddle. He walked over to the board. He looked for the slot marked NUR signage, TMP. It was empty. He ran to the front desk. He asked the administrator for the file on Maren Kerrigan. He asked for her address, her next of kin, her phone number. The administrator looked at him with tired, confused eyes. She typed the name into the system. "Doctor," she said, frowning at the screen. "We don't have a Maren Kerrigan in the system. That shift was covered by an agency float. The paperwork, it's just blank." Rost froze. The realization settled in his gut like cold lead. She hadn't just escaped. She had been erased. The woman who had stood next to him, who had faked a panic attack to save his life, who had cracked a man's throat to save a child, she didn't exist. He walked out the automatic doors, into the cool morning air. He looked toward the tree line at the edge of the parking lot. For a second, just a fraction of a heartbeat, he thought he saw a figure standing in the shadows of the pines. A small woman in a dark jacket, watching the hospital. She wasn't looking at the police. She wasn't looking at Voss escaping. She was looking at the ambulance where the boy was being treated. Rost blinked, and she was gone. Maren Kerrigan, or whatever her name really was, had paid the price. She had exposed her skill to save the boy, and in doing so, she had burned her sanctuary. She couldn't be a nurse here anymore. She couldn't be normal. The silence she craved, the anonymity she had built so carefully, was the cost of the boy's life. She was back in the cold now. Back on the road. Back to being a ghost. The truth is, heroism isn't about glory. It isn't about the medal or the interview. It's about the quiet, terrible math of trading your own peace for someone else's survival. It's about walking away into the rain while everyone else walks into the light, knowing that you can never go back inside. Thank you for listening to the story of the nurse who wasn't there. If you believe that the heaviest burdens are the ones carried in silence, make sure you're subscribed for the next briefing.